and I'm a 3D animator. Most of my work has been in short films, and I'm currently working in the video game industry. Now, I've learned a lot of techniques across the year about Autodesk Maya, but my biggest passion is about character animation. What I love about 3D animation is that you don't need to be great at drawing in order to start animating. And animating in 3D is much more like playing around with digital puppets inside a computer screen. Now, I've designed this class as part of a series to teach the fundamentals of animation, which I find are missing in many other 3D courses. Today, we're going to focus in creating dynamic poses for animation. And my approach tends to be that I give people specific tools, like the ones that I do regularly at work, because I spend a lot of time posing characters for creating animations, and I teach them how to actually use those techniques in order to improving their own animations. One of the core skills of animation is learning how to create strong poses. And during this class, I'm going to be demonstrating to you guys through examples how we can correctly identify and use specific techniques in order to design some good dynamic poses that may have strength in their storytelling potential or in their action potential. We'll then look at some do's and don'ts in terms of posing, and I'll also be giving you examples of how we can exaggerate body language or add appeal to parts of the body like the face or the hands so that your posing gets stronger and more professional. You'll end up learning a lot about body mechanics and how to communicate things visually just through your posing. And we'll finish off by creating a project where we're going to create a very simple story just told in 3 simple story beats. This will be the initial steps of a plan for a longer animation that will go completing over future Skillshare classes. But this lesson will be all about how to understand your story in poses and how to improve the potential of your own creative ideas. For this class, you don't have to be an expert on Maya, and you can actually follow along with any other 3D software that you might be more familiar with. All you need to complete the class is to have access to a computer, any version of Maya, and to download a 3D character rig. Now, I'm going to add to the resources section on the project page of this class a list of links to various free 3D rigs for Maya that you can use to follow along in this class. Now, if you're struggling with Maya, I've already published an earlier class where I talk about the fundamentals of spacing for animation, where I give an introduction on how to animate inside of Maya as well. This class is for people who want to learn how to animate and people who want to explore their creative ideas in how to start creating animations. So, if you want to learn more about creating dynamic poses for animation, join me in the class and I'll be looking forward to see which projects and which ideas you guys come up with. So dive straight in. So I'm going to start working with the Kyler rig from Josh Sobel, and you can use any free rig for this exercise, but I'm going to start off by creating my initial pose, and I'm going to be using just the move tool by pressing W on my keyboard and moving different parts of her body around, and using the rotate tool by pressing E on the keyboard and moving the limbs into position. Most of the time these will be the only 2 controls that I use. And rarely will I use scale, which Kayla does have some scale properties which can be used, and also she has some custom properties as well to give shape to her eyebrows and her lips, and those can be found in the channel box. Layout-wise in Maya, I will always have a camera, which is on the left-hand side, which is like the point of view of the character, but I'll also be having another view with perspective as well, where I'll be looking around, and I'll always be favoring the pose from the camera point of view, but I will be spinning around in the perspective view on the right and checking that things make sense in 3D space as well. And I'll vary that throughout the exercise, but most of the time I'm going to be posing from the perspective camera and checking things from the final shot camera on the left-hand side. So we're going to start off by building a key pose. In traditional animation, a key is what animators call a storytelling pose. Some people refer to them as golden poses or attitude drawings, but regardless of what they're called, the purpose of a key is to show the audience clearly what is happening in the shot. They tend to be the strongest storytelling poses that you would have inside of a shot, and normally they're very clearly showing out the character's emotional state or the action that he or she is trying to perform. In this case, I have Kayla talking angrily to somebody on the right side of screen, and I'm going to use that as the beat to define all of the elements that I design for this pose. Now in 3D animation, people tend to get confused with the fact that Maya has keyframes as a term for any state we save on the timeline, and we have this animation term which is a key. While animators will want to categorize the different keyframes into different groups from the Maya timeline, we are mostly defining them in terms of if the keyframe is a key, an extreme, a breakdown, or an in-between. We'll learn more about these categories in future lessons, but just so that you know that there are ways that animators can describe to one another of what is the function of the specific keyframe that they have on their timeline. Now, the way that I tend to work when I'm designing one of my key poses is that I tend to work in a quick pass, just going from the hips, posing the legs, working my way up the spine, and then out through the arms. And I'll very quickly pose things like the face and the fingers in very rough positions to start off with. I tend to find that with this rough pass, I can very quickly see what's wrong with my pose, and I can spend time actually fixing the things that I see wrong to make sure that she's angry and complaining to somebody. In my second pass, I'll go over the body again and try to work on the curves of the spine, pose the fingers in interesting and different positions, and work on the facial expressions as well so that they're a bit more custom and they've got a nice sense of flow to them. Now, animating is a sequential art form, and just like storyboarding or comics, we're going to try and tell a story with the minimum number of poses possible. As a rule of thumb, I'd always recommend that in a shot you should always focus on having 2 or 3 keys, as this will improve the readability of the animation and give us a clearer sense of the action. Throughout this tutorial, you're going to hear me again and again referring down to simplifying things and improving the clarity of the poses. And this attention to detail is really what makes great animation stand out. As an animator, you're constantly looking at body mechanics and different types of acting beats that you put into your work, and it's important to have that level of detail put in even at this basic time when we're planning out a shot by creating these key poses. Now, the face is the last thing that I tend to pose when I'm creating my keys, and that's because the face is really expressive and it's very much a distraction for me from what the rest of the body is doing, and I want the body language and the face language to read at the same time. The face is a really malleable part of the body. It squeezes and it stretches, and we should move every aspect of the face as well. Move the eyelids, move the cheeks, move the nose. It's almost as if the face was made of rubber and we kind of like have to add that little bit of attention to the curves and the detail that we see across the different shapes of the mouth or the position of the eyes. So when we finish posing, it's a good time to evaluate how successful our pose has been just by looking at it from all angles in the 3D viewport. Now, my final pro tip is that you should never be afraid when you're creating poses to look at reference. This can be a photo reference or it can be video reference from YouTube or animated films, but I really recommend you guys to build yourself a Pinterest board with a lot of drawings and poses and illustrations which show characters in a whole range of different emotions and different interesting poses. You should build up a visual library about what different emotions and actions actually look like, so you've got something that you can refer to constantly. And it's not cheating to use reference. Observation is a key aspect of what an animator does, and just like an illustrator builds an interesting pose, an animator will create interesting actions off what they observe. As a general rule, we want to avoid seeing straight lines through the body. We're favoring curves, actually. So the line of action is actually an imaginary line that goes through the body that tries to describe the entire pose in a single stroke. It's like trying to reduce all the detail of the body into a single graphic line. So we're going to take Kayla and we are going to have her jumping up in a ballet type pose. Now ballet is great because it has, by its own nature, a nice flowing line and directionality to most of its poses. But it also is graceful and she's meant to seem like happy and almost as if it took no effort. Because we're animating, we are also going to exaggerate the pose so she jumps really high into the air, and we're going to make sure that all the limbs have this nice sense of direction. To create dynamic poses, we will think about the body as a collection of graphic shapes. And the more flowing or angular those shapes are, the more dynamic the end pose will be. It's really important to create your poses by placing first the three main shapes of the body, which are the hips, the chest, and the head. In animation, we're always simplifying our designs to make our readability much clearer. Think of the line of action as a simple C shape or an S shape. You can also create the reverse of a C or the reverse of an S as well. Very rarely do you want some things to be like an I, perfectly straight and rigid. You can also notice in the video that I take time to actually pose all of the parts of the body and all of the controllers, going from the tip of the toes all the way to the hair. It's important that you add these little elements because by default, 3D characters look very stiff and dead, and to make them feel more dynamic, we do have to do a bit of manual tweaking here and there. So to make a strong line of action, we want to make this line as strong as possible. We're going to take it all the way up through the leg, up through the spine, past the head, and right out the arms. Even push the fingers along the line of action and stretch them out so that the pose is even stronger and more dynamic. Now, one of the things we have to learn when posing is to know the limits of the rig that we're using. As you can see over here in the groin area, we've got this weird deformation happening, and that's going to influence how we actually pose the leg. We'll have to find a compromise where the leg still looks stretched and dynamic, but is not really adding those horrible creases that we're seeing here. It's also important when we're designing dynamic poses that we don't push the pose so far that the character goes off model. Kayla can be off model if we move her limbs or features so far that she starts being less recognizable as the character that she was originally designed. So even when making poses, we have to think about that there are some limits to what we can do with the character, just so she remains recognizable. So now that we've blocked out our pose, we can start refining it by using the grease pencil tool. If we come up to the viewport and click on the little icon that has a marker pen on it, we'll bring up this panel and push the plus button to create a grease pencil frame. And we can select a color and a pen tool and start roughing out the line of action as an inverse C shape. Then we can go into our tools, select a new color, and the curve can also go through the arm, so we can rough that out to give it a bit of sense of flow, and then we can think about what the forward leg should flow in. So I'm just creating some curves that look like some tangents that come out of the main line. With this setup, I'm going to use those rough curves that I made, and I'll continue modifying my pose. Now, it's a great technique to draw over your poses because sometimes it's really hard to pose things inside of the 3D viewport, but as soon as you draw a curve or a few guidelines, it instantly becomes much easier to see what is wrong with your pose. We again have some problem of some creases appearing in the groin area, but here's where I can share with you guys a pro tip on how to fix your poses by sculpting them with blend shapes. What we need to do is select the mesh for Kayla's leg and go into Window, Animation Editor, Shape Editor. We'll get a new pop-up window and we'll click on Create Blend Shape and add a new target. Now you can see that Kayla already has many blend shapes and these allow the rig to deform naturally. However, we're making a new blend shape that will be right at the bottom of the list. I'll then go into the Maya Sculpting Tools shelf and choose the grab brush. I can change the size of the brush by holding down the B key and dragging with the mouse. You can also change the brush pressure by pressing M and also dragging with the left mouse button. With the grab brush, we can push the polygon of Kayla's leg around on the screen, almost as if they were made out of elastic. I can hold down Shift and the left mouse button and drag, and this will smooth out the polygons. We can also take the sculpt brush in areas that are heavily creased and extrude out some polygons and make them smooth until the geometry looks nice and finished. You can push the shape of the legs with any modeling tools you'd like using any of the Maya available tools. I'm just using the sculpt brush to do a quick job here. The blend shapes are additive shapes that work on top of the base geometry. If we go back to frame 1, you'll see that now Kayla is in a T-pose, but we can see some wrinkling as the blend shape is now deforming her leg. The good news is that we can key this value on and off by saving a keyframe in the shape editor. So if we go back to the shape editor and go to frame 2, we can key the blend shape by pressing the circular button at the end of the list until it turns red. We can then come back to frame 1 and pull the slider to 0 for the blend shape, and Auto Key should automatically add a keyframe here for us, turning the shape on and off. Now this is a demo, but if I was going to animate a whole sequence using this technique, I'd make the blend shapes and key them just before finishing the final animation. Now I've created a really bad pose to really showcase what a bad silhouette looks like. In this case, it almost looks like her head's growing out of her legs in the camera view. Now notice in the pose, Kayla is also holding the ball, which is facing towards the camera, and this gets lost within her head. Now the ball, her hands, they're all caught in within the main mass of her body. In animation, we want to make sure our characters have a clear silhouette so that we can kind of understand what's happening in the scene, even if we saw it at a glance. If we hide the floor plane in Maya, we can press the Turn On Lights button in our viewport, which is a little light bulb, or we can press 7 on our keyboard, and this will turn on the lights in our viewport. The silhouette is the biggest and most encompassing shape of our pose. It's a great way of seeing the whole body clearly, and this is a great way to help us find any problems that there may be in our poses, and to quickly design the shape of the body as a graphic shape. You'll see that the pose makes sense if we rotate the camera in the perspective view to a certain degree, and that will make the throwing of this ball pose look a little bit clearer. Now it's important that if things aren't working at any time in your animation, it's a good time to repose. And what we want to do is take the body and put it into a slightly different pose. We will rotate the body around slightly so that it's clearer in the camera view, and we'll start spacing out the limbs a little bit better. We'll work on the torso, and we'll work on the arms and the hand poses, and adjust the head position as well, just so that everything reads better from our camera. A lot of times, just by turning our character by 30 or 40 degrees might help us make the pose a lot clearer. To make Kayla's pose feel more dynamic, we're going to look at her line of action and we're actually going to take it and tilt it to a side so it forms more of a diagonal curve to screen left. By having her slightly off balance, it's going to feel like she's more in motion, and it's really going to help us sell the idea that she's throwing this ball with great force. By keeping the ball separate from the body, we're going to give it a more sense that it's being thrown away from Kyla's hand. And we're going to use the rear hand and the bent foot to kind of like give her a sense of balance as well, so that she's almost catching her weight. Switching on our lights again, we can see how the silhouette is looking. It's a little bit clearer, but it's still not right. We can tell that there's a little bit more balance that needs to come into the pose, and also we need to work on the silhouette of the fingers a bit more so that it really feels like she's actually throwing the ball. So the reason why creating a clear silhouette is so important for animation is that when we have an animated character like Kayla, she's slightly cartoony. There's not really that much detail in her. She's a simplified version of a human being. In this case, what we need to do is that we need to make her expressions and her poses much more clearer than, say, a realistic character, because there's less detail that we can work on. An example I always give to students is the idea that imagine that you're looking at somebody and they're 50 meters or 200 yards down a road. They're really, really, really tiny, but you can still pick up a lot of their body language even at a distance. What we're really doing is exaggerating things to make things clear. So if somebody was trying to point something out to you from far away, their gestures would be much more exaggerated. Now that's just the way that we have to think about doing these poses. They're not meant to be realistic, but they're meant to be an interpretation of what we see in reality. When posing the head, don't forget, if your character has hair or a ponytail like Kayla has, to actually pose that out as well. Now in this case we're doing an action pose, so we're going to drag the hair behind the head and give it a little bit of a wave so that it feels like it's caught in the wind. So even though we're posing from one main camera, we are going to finish off by looking at the pose in the perspective view and checking that it works from all angles. It's almost like it has to work like it's a sculpture more than a flat drawing. Now let's look at the end silhouette and see the final pose. There could be some improvements still, and we could even make the line of action even clearer, but now it's got a nice sense of flow to it. And the main thing that I can say about the pose is that it is exceptionally clear that she is throwing a ball, and her direction and her intentions are very, 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 very clear at a glance. And we want to use silhouette as a way of understanding how to actually create good poses. Another aspect that can help us define great dynamic poses is to consider the weight of a character, its balance, and if it has any forces being acted on it. In 3D software, objects don't have physical weight. When we're posing our character, we're adding that physicality ourselves in the way we position the spine and the limbs. A great way of thinking about 3D meshes and characters is that they're very much like soap bubbles. They've got no physicality to them, and they're almost like ghosts as well, because they can interpenetrate different pieces of geometry as well. So positioning them is really important for us as an animator. A character's own weight can be a deciding factor on if the character is athletic or light or heavy, but we can also think about a character's weight as what happens when they're interacting with objects that are light or heavy. Now let's look at this pose that we've made for Kayla. She's holding out the sphere, which almost feels like a beach ball or a ball made out of light polystyrene. She's lifting it up with no effort. Notice that her limbs are mostly straight. There's no influence on her spine that the ball is causing any weight that causes her to bend over, and she really just has to make small adjustments to her hip and raise her arm out just to stay in balance. This makes the character feel light, and it's one of the big problems that beginners have when creating animation, which is that they're not aware of the body mechanics of how to make a character feel heavy or under the weight of a heavy object. A good way of describing a character's weight is to think about where the character's center of gravity is in every pose that we make. Sometimes animators will refer to this as the location of the cog. Now, the center of gravity doesn't have to just be a controller that some rigs have. It's actually a point on the body where the character's weight is actually distributed. It's almost like the center of balance, which normally would be for a normal character under no weight, just to be kind of like slightly above the hips, depending on their design. However, when you pick up a heavy object, the location of the center of gravity moves. In this case, Kayla's center of gravity will move up her body as she holds this very heavy sphere above her shoulders, almost in an atlas type of position. To make Kayla feel like she's under a heavy weight, we're going to take the pose and see that there is a greater variety between straights and curves through the body. The line of action isn't as smooth and clear, but actually bends in an S type of shape. We can see that her weight has changed to share the weight on the balls of her feet, and she's keeping herself in balance by firmly planting her feet on the ground. Her knees bend, her spine squashes, even her expression on her face is squeezed and showing effort over here. Now again, this is an exaggerated pose, but while under the effect of weight, we can think about the body as a spring that is being compressed, and we want to put those compression lines and a good variation of straights and curves into the design, and that will make the character feel like they're being held under a weight. If you're struggling creating believable weight, you should always take up looking at good reference photos of athletes, weight trainers, or whichever subject you are trying to capture in your animations. If you still struggle with these poses, another thing you can do is also jump out of your chair and actually act out the pose. This is a great way to actually feel where the weight and balance is in a pose. Acting things out can be one of the best ways of figuring out how the weight changes and shifts between one pose and another. When a character's in a relaxed state, they will normally be in balance, and when we're in balance, we normally have an evenly distributed weight. Now, in this pose, we can see that we also have an evenly distributed weight, but thanks to the physicality of Kayla, she's actually holding up her entire weight on one leg. Now, usually the straight leg that we have in a pose will be carrying the weight, and here I'm just adding a slight bend to it to show that she's holding up a heavy weight of her upper torso. Notice how her chin goes in line with the leg, and she has to balance out her leg and her arm to keep her body in balance. Forces acted upon the character can be another aspect to take into consideration when designing dynamic poses. Most of these times, these will be internal forces driven by the character's own movement. When a character walks, they're exerting force through their muscles to move in a particular direction. But on other times, some forces can be external, when a character will be reacting to them. This can be like being punched when in combat, or being dragged along by something. Most of the time, you can reduce these to thinking about if the character is being pulled or pushed, and pose the character as opposing or following that main force. So we can see here that Kayla is under the influence of a force, which is a dog moving at high speed. Now, we can notice that there are some things similar to when we describe weight, which is that there is a nice variation between straights and curves in the body. We can see her legs are trying to oppose the movement and they're bent. We can see the upper body is more being pulled along by the force. If we were to draw this out, we could see that the main force runs from screen left to right. And we then can look at the rest of the body. If we drew the line of action going up through the legs, through the spine, it would go around the shoulders, through the arms, out the hands, and follow the same line that the main force is on. The legs would be bent, opposing the force by friction, and elements like the hair would just drag along as they are loose and have no will of their own. Now, by combining where the character's weight is, if they are or they're not in balance, and understanding if they're under the effects of any forces, we can start to design more dynamic type of poses. And it's important to write these things down and actually start thinking about them until they become second nature. Now, two common mistakes to look out for when posing your characters are twinning and tangents. Even the default T-pose that most characters come in is a very unnatural looking pose. We very rarely see people posed out like this. A twinned pose is when the limbs of the character are too symmetrical to one another. In this example, you can see Kayla holding up her arms in the air, but notice that the angle at which the arms go up is very much exactly the same. We've exaggerated this effect as well by actually making the face as well more symmetrical, and she's standing up in a very Y-like position. Now, it's important that when we've got these very straight symmetrical poses, they feel less natural. We will want to add curves into our pose and line of action, and also we want to make sure that the limbs can be at slightly different positions to one another. Twinning can appear in any pose, and to fix it we have to remember that our characters are inside a 3D space. We can move the limbs into a whole variety of directions and create a more appealing pose. Now, these changes can be subtle. We can still keep her with her arms above her head, but what we want to do is work into the pose to have a certain level of asymmetry, and this will make it look more natural and more appealing. We have encountered problems with tangents before when we were looking at the character's silhouette. Tangents appear when the character's silhouette is not clear and the limbs intersect the outline of the silhouette. In this case, we can see that Kayla's rear hand looks like it's growing out from behind her ear. It's very difficult to tell where the ear and the forearm begin. We will have to move the arm out a little bit and adjust the shoulder just to make sure that it's very clear that the arm is separate from the actual head. Our goal still remains to design the clearest silhouette possible and to allow a quick and accurate reading of the pose. Remember that poses in animation are more staged than live action or in film, so we have to make sure that we reduce overlapping shapes with the silhouette. Arms and fingers are normally the main offenders of these, but remember to look out for anything that might be intersecting the silhouette of the character and see if there's a way of clearing it up. Always aim to simplify your designs down as much as possible. Now I'm going to continue designing Kayla's victory pose, but it's important to realize that tangents and twinnings seem like very obvious things, but they do creep up in your work constantly. There's almost a subconscious nature that makes them creep into your work without you noticing. The best way to make sure that these mistakes don't happen is actually to get some good, honest feedback. This is a real important part of the animation process, and you should get used to showing your friends or fellow animators your work while it still isn't finished, so that they can point out those mistakes that you might not be able to see because you've been working too long on a series of poses, but they'll jump out straight away to somebody who's seeing it fresh for the first time. You can also take advantage of posting your poses in the project section of the Skillshare page, and you'll be able to get feedback from myself about your poses as well, and I might actually post some further material with some draw-overs and some videos to show people the main mistakes of what they're making when they're doing their class project. So we've finished posing the victory pose, and probably it's as exaggerated as can be. It's also very asymmetrical, but it shows a very clear, distinct personality to Kayla, and it's much more interesting to look at than the default standard pose that we started off at the beginning of the video. In the early stages of animation, we'll be receiving direction normally from a script if we're working professionally, or we might be looking at a storyboard, or we might just have a cool idea in our head of what we want to actually make if it's a personal project. What we need to consider is that when we're designing poses, we need to be able to have a certain level of variety in our work, and we'll want to create poses for the same situation but that are different in various ways. If we have a simple brief of a character has to walk across the screen, there's many different ways that they could do this, mostly depending on the acting and the emotions that we want to show in the particular shot. So if they're walking excitedly across the screen to open a door or pick up a cookie, they're going to look in a specific way, and their body language will reflect this. Here we're using the posing to convey the emotions, actions, and feelings of the character without over-relying on dialogue or on the facial expressions of a character. If we take Kayla and we have her walking across the screen, but this time in a more depressed and hunched over stance, we'll start recognizing that the body language is conveying a completely different type of emotion. It's important that these poses are exaggerated versions of what we observe, but it's important that that exaggeration allows the body language to be very clear. If somebody is sad, we're going to make them very, very sad, so that it is absolutely clear at a glance the emotion that they're feeling. And again, this will be in relation to the acting and the choices that we want to make into our pose. Now, it's a great exercise to design a multitude of poses for a same situation. This can be to design 9 or 10 poses for different ways of walking, or 9 or 10 poses for how you could wait at a bus stop. But it's important that we choose one emotion for each one of these poses and we stick to it. As a simple rule, try to keep one emotion to one pose. Never try to mix things together, like trying to be afraid and courageous at the same time. Stick to using simple emotions at the beginning, like being angry, happy, sad, smug, and try to keep your poses and your emotions clear. So when Kayla's running across the screen scared, we're trying to get a sense of urgency inside the pose itself, and we're still using the same techniques that we've been using up until now. We can also look at these 3 different poses by the design of their line of action. And their line of action is very much defining the gesture in a very simple way. If we're looking at the excited pose, we can see that the line of action is a C-type shape curved, and that it is pointing in the direction in which C is moving. Everything is fluid and kind of like upbeat. And if we compare that to the sad walk, we'll see that we have a reversed S-shape type of line of action going through the body. She squashes down a little bit, she's a lot less confident, and even her eye line is looking downwards as well. And for the final pose, we can see that the line of action is also a C shape, but it's much more in a diagonal. The feet almost look like they're moving faster than the rest of her body, and that again helps sell this idea of being scared and having a great sense of urgency. Now, finally, it's important to point out that the body language is really working by itself. Even though we have the face as well in these poses and the emotions match the actual expression, we can kind of see that if we hide the face away, the emotion is still clear in the body language. It's important to realize that the poses, the face, even the position of the fingers all add to creating an expressive pose. And we should use the body language and the face together as two tools that allow us to better tell the expression and the emotion in these poses. How can we create a dynamic facial pose? Again, it comes down to looking for some good reference. And before you go scavenging through the internet, let me recommend you a more low-tech solution. Try find yourself a small mirror and put it next to your desk. Just by looking into a mirror, you can start to analyze and understand how your own face works. If you haven't got on one of these archaic devices nearby, well, you can also grab yourself a mobile phone and start taking some selfies. It's a good time to start learning how to make your own reference for animating. The first